This is Tipping Point Radio. I'm Craig Merriweather, and you're listening to The Mastermind Show. If you suffer from the effects of trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder, whether it was caused by a single incident like a car accident, or from chronic childhood abuse, domestic violence, illness, or war trauma, you are well aware of how disconnected you feel from the person you most deeply wish to be. Trauma interrupts, even hijacks, your identity. To cope, you may rely on mechanisms to keep your emotions, triggers, and responses in check. But these very habits can often prevent the true restoration of safety, stability, and inner connection. How can you rediscover your sense of self so that you honor who you were before the trauma, even if that trauma began at birth? How can you understand who you are at this very moment and determine who you want to be going forward? My guest today is Michele Rosenthal. In 1981, as a 13-year-old child, Michele was given a routine antibiotic for a routine infection and suffered anything but a routine reaction. An undiscovered allergy to the medication turned her into a full-body burn victim almost overnight. By the time Michele was released from the hospital, she had lost 100% of her epidermis, or the top layer of her skin. And as she says in her book, even more importantly, she had completely lost herself. She struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for over 25 years before reaching a full recovery. Today, she is 100% PTSD free and is now a professional coach who specializes in helping trauma victims rebuild their lives. She's the author of 2 books, Your Life After Trauma, Powerful Practices to Reclaim Your Identity, and Before the World Intruded, Conquering the Past and Creating the Future. Now here's my interview with Michele Rosenthal. Hello, Michele. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Craig. Thank you so much for having me. It feels good to be back in this space with you.
Well, we're having some interesting discussions off mic leading up to this interview, and it's just real interesting talking with you about a sense of identity as you're going through depression, as you're dealing with trauma, and who are you after the fact? Who do you become? Are you a different person because of that? And it seemed like such an interesting conversation. I thought maybe we'd talk about it on this interview. And the thing that I found when going through depression, and the reason I struggled with finding a way out or getting to the point where I said, I need help and I need to change this, is because it felt like that was who I was. Like this depression was me, and this depressed state, even though there were organic reasons for me being that way, meaning that, there's trauma in my life, there was possible head injury kind of things. I accepted that as who I was, and so I didn't think I could change.
I think that's so typical. It's so common. I had the same experience. I went through a trauma as a kid or as an early adolescent, and I never really came out of it. Craig, it changed me so completely from a kid who was pretty, happy and adjusted into a teenager who was sullen and depressed and angry all the time. And so I know what you mean. You become sort of morphed into this other kind of headspace where everything is dark and black. And my mom used to follow me around when I was in high school for days saying to me, just talk to me. What's the matter? Just talk to me. And I would constantly say, you just can't understand what it's like being in here. And I can't even explain it. And it was at that time that I started understanding what happened, for several years, almost 20 years, from the time I was a teenager until my late 30s, when I was just so depressed all the time. And it really became, I am depression rather than I am Michele, Yeah. And so I know what you mean, Craig, because it becomes who you are. And then we think that defines who we are because it defines how we see the world. But those are actually 2 different things. How we see the world and who we are aren't necessarily the same thing. How we see the world doesn't define who we are in the world unless we allow it to. And then you're right. We get in this place where I've been like this for so long. This must be who I am. And I literally thought that was true for a long time. I thought some people are just supposed to be crazy and insane and depressed, and I'm one of them. And then we accept, which Craig, I think is the saddest part, right? Is that we accept that not only is this the way it is and it can't change, but there's nothing we can do about it, so we may as well just submit to it. And I think that's the saddest moment.
Well, and I felt that in my own situation. It's just there's nothing you can do about it, and this is who I am. So how is it possible to change? And it took a lot of education and I guess you'd say reprogramming of those beliefs for me to start looking for ways out and to start that whole process. And that was a whole huge shift in and of itself. And it's sort of like, your windows covered up in mud, over the years from all the storms and horrendous weather. But that doesn't mean that the sunshine and light isn't still out there. It's just kind of covered up. And if you could get to the point where you say, okay, yes, I've had these issues, but that doesn't define me. I get to define who I am.
That's very true. And that's the moment, I think, Craig, that we start reclaiming who we are. In that moment of saying, I get to do this, I choose. Because so often when we stop choosing, we start living by default. And I see this with so many mental health issues, whether it's depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety or panic or whatever it is. We give into those things and we give our power to those things. And when we give our power away, whatever we give our power away to is the thing that then has the power to define us. When we start taking it back, when we start saying, no, wait a minute, like you just said, I get to define me. That's, to me, when we start doing the whole redefinition process, because in that moment of making that choice and then taking the subsequent actions, you start to change. And you start to change who you are, which means then you start to change what defines you. And so you've just so beautifully elucidated the one moment when it all begins. It's with that thought of taking back your power.
Yeah. And, what I always found is that education is the best tool. If you're constantly going through life with the same knowledge, you're probably not going to change, but it's through reading books and listening to interviews like this and going to workshops and getting a coach and getting a support team where you get that help to start that process of change, because every successful athlete and musician and CEO, business person, small business person, large CEO of a company has some sort of coach and training, constant training to grow and to evolve into would I say a better person or a stronger person.
I think that's true, and you're so right. It can be critical to feel you're not alone, because by definition, often when we have mental health issues, we feel alone. We feel like nobody, like what I used to yell at my mom, you can't understand what it's like in here. But of course there are people who can, whether it's because they're trained professionals or because they're trained professionals who have a history with this, or your peers, are a great place to find support, because there are always people who understand. And I think to add on and build to what you're saying, education is the first step, and knowledge and understanding. And then the second step to me is commitment. The idea that I don't know how I'm going to get this done, but I know I'm going to keep going until I do, because it's that perseverance and that dedication that eventually pushes you through all the challenges and all the obstacles that arise when you decide to make a change. For example, the minute you decide to make a change, often what I see when I work with people, whether I'm private coaching or I do a lot of group coaching and speaking, so it's big audiences and we have conversations, the first thing that happens when you want to make a change is there'll be a part of you that jumps up and says, oh, no, I object. And then there's the whole inner negotiation that has to go on about, what's holding you back from being able to step into that place of change. And then once you move into that place of change and say, okay, I really am able to stand here and mean it, then there are going to be all kinds of things that challenge your resolve. And what's going to keep you going? It's going to be your commitment. So I think it's really important for each person to find the reason. we follow through on things because they're meaningful and important to us. So it's important to know what you want to do, and it's important to couple that with why you're doing it, because then when the challenges come, it's much easier to stay on track because you have, what we call emotional buy-in. You're bonded and connected with what you're doing. If I just say, for example, the what is I want to feel better. Okay, well, that's great. Why do you want to feel better? Well, I want to feel better so that I can, really deeply connect with my partner and be able to be there for my friends and have a meaningful personal life outside of work. Now we start elucidating and illuminating for ourselves the real benefits of committing to the change. And so when you put the education that you're talking about together with the commitment of really knowing why and making it meaningful that you're going to step into this change, I think you put together a really powerful foundation then for being successful at it.
Well, you just talked about finding meaning and importance, and I was wondering, wanted to get your thoughts about what if somebody finds it meaningful and important to stay the way they are, this trauma or this depression and this feeling of them in their lives. It creates maybe a way to feel people are giving them love or attention in some way, and so it would be meaningful and important to them to stay the way they are because they feel, well, that's the way I'm receiving love at the moment.
That's a really good point. You're talking really about secondary gains, right? There's a reason why it's good for me to be this way. I'll give you an example, and I write about this in my book that's coming out early next year. It's called Your Life After Trauma, Powerful Practices to Reclaim Your Identity. I mean, the whole book is about how do we take back our identity. And I write about one of my clients in the book who had all of these symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression being one of the biggest ones. She never got out of the bed. Literally, she would watch the same movie all day over and over and over from her bed. She didn't shower. She didn't interact with family. She had a husband. She had grandchildren. She didn't see anybody. And when we started working together, she said to me, "Oh no, my PTSD symptoms are so bad. My depression is so awful. I can't get out of the bed." And I said, and so we started having a conversation. I said, well, let's just say that you did, what would happen? What would you do throughout the day if you were to get out of bed? And through our conversation, one of the things that came out was, well, I would have to close all the shades, lock all the doors, and never pick up the phone because my family would try to come and see me or reach out to me because they want things and they need things. And if they know that I'm out of the bed and I'm functional, then they won't ever leave me alone. And she had a very abusive family history, and she was trying to get away from her parents and her siblings. And so that speaks beautifully, don't you think, to what you're talking about, because she really had created an entire life around her symptoms to keep her safe. That was really what they were doing. It was creating a boundary between her and all the toxic people in her life. And one of the things that we first started working on was how to put boundaries in place that were healthy so that she actually could get up and get out of the bed without being afraid of the repercussions. So I think it's important for each person when they encounter something like what you brought up, Craig, is to really sit and figure out, why do I need that? Why do I need this depression in order for people to love me? To stay in example, stay within the confines of your example. Why? What is it about my depression that is so lovable? And you could go two ways with that. Number one, really, what is so lovable? Are you a softer, more gentle, more affectionate person because you're depressed? Well, that's great to know, because then you can figure out how can you be soft, gentle, and affectionate in other ways outside of depression. Or are you more lovable when you're depressed because the people around you are toxic and they are more willing to love somebody who's hurting than they are to love a strong person? Well, then that lets you start to know you need to get away from these people. So it's always good to start asking questions. And one of my favorite questions, the best questions are the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why. Using those questions to find the answers that are holding you to the things that are holding you back. Does that make sense? Does that
Yeah.
answer what you were
Yeah,
saying?
I think so. It's just that process of, yeah, if you're holding on to this, and certainly there's a time where grief needs to enter into the picture, and you need to let these emotions move through you. But after a certain point of time, it's, are you letting the emotions and the that energy flow, and it's flowing through you and out of you, or are you holding on to it and blocking its progress? And 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 this again, where coaches and a support team comes into play, and you start talking about these issues, and this is when that stuff can come up, and you maybe start looking at why you may be holding on to this and why it may be scary to let go of it. There's certainly a protection element to holding on to this stuff.
Definitely. And that's what I was alluding to earlier when I said the minute you decide to make a change, there will be a part of you that stands up and says, oh no, I object. And it's that part, that resistance, that is always motivated by some fear. What will be lost? What will happen? What will you have to do? Whatever it is. And that fear has to be addressed before the change is made. And working through that resistance, figuring out what is it specifically that you are resisting, and then why are you resisting it? What's the fear that's associated with that resistance? And then what do you need to do to ameliorate the fear, to release it, to reduce it, to eliminate it? Doing all of that work before you come back to the starting line and say, okay, now I'm ready to make the change. And sometimes you have to do that fear resistance process, fear resistance release process over and over until you sort of work out the main issues that are holding you back so that you really can move forward with a sense of calm and confidence.
Yeah. Well, what are some ways, if somebody's at the point where they say, I want to reclaim my true identity, I want to be done with all these negative and blocked emotions, what are some ways that someone can reclaim their identity?
That's my favorite question. So thank you for asking it. I want to start with this relates a little bit to what you were saying earlier about holding on to things. And my first book was Before the World Intruded: Conquering the Past and Creating the Future. And in Before the World Intruded, I write all about depression and post-trauma symptoms and the recovery process and the success that's possible in the recovery process. And I end the book with this great quote from Judith Herman that I absolutely love. And, she wrote the book Trauma and Recovery, early 1990s. She was way at the forefront of how to overcome the past. And her book is still just so relevant today. But there's this quote in it that I just love. And she writes, "The survivor may wonder how she can possibly give her due respect to the horror she has endured if she no longer devotes her life to remembrance and warning." And I absolutely just so resonate with the idea of being stuck where you are. Like, we get stuck in that space with depression, and we think for whatever reason we've gotten depressed, like that's an integral part of who we are and we have to stay there. And I think Judith Lewis Herman's quote is so poignant because it speaks to the idea of renegotiating what it is that's caused us to feel so unhappy and how we move forward from it. So in thinking about how do we reclaim and how do we, to me, really reconstruct and redefine everything, is all about three different processes. And the first, I think, really starts with something that you mentioned earlier, which is grief. Letting those emotions move through you. In order to release something, we have to be comfortable facing it, because it's only when we can stand in the same place that we can actually triumph over it. So I think that the first step is always looking back. And the way that I see reclaiming an identity, it works in three consecutive phases. The the past, the present, and the future. So number one, looking back and grieving and honoring the part of you, because that's what it is. Depression is a part of you. There's a huge you, and depression is a part of who you are. And so it's looking back at the self that has engaged in this depression and really honoring and respecting why and the purpose of it, and remembering it and grieving what has happened that caused it or what's been lost because of it. So I think the grieving process is very important. At the same time, and we have only a limited amount of time here, Craig, but the process that I'm describing here is really in depth with all kinds of exercises in my book, Your Life After Trauma. So we'll go over the basics of it, but drilling down, there are so many ways to do this. So once you really face and acknowledge and grieve, then it's important to honor. I think so often, and you could tell me if you agree with this, but I think so often we sort of hate that self that got so off track. I know I certainly did. I just really hated myself for becoming such a depressed person. Did you ever feel that way?
Oh, yeah. It's hard to talk about, but it's just one of those, again, this could be a 3-hour conversation about this, but you just feel so stuck is the way I felt.
Right. You feel so stuck. And I felt so embarrassed and ashamed for being so stuck. I mean, my life went on after the trauma. Anybody else, other people would have bounced back. I mean, why didn't I bounce back? Well, okay, that's a whole other conversation. But I had to really get out of that space of hating myself and learn to honor. I did the best I could in the circumstances, and they were overwhelming, because depression doesn't happen because you stub your toe. Depression happens because something really significantly overwhelming happens, in my opinion. If it was easy and simple, we would get over it. But it's more complex and complicated than that. And I think we need to honor that self that got caught up in it, that engaged in it, that needed that at that time for whatever reason. And so I think it's really important to have compassion for that self. And at the same time, the third component here in looking back at the past is also looking back at who you were. Either we could go two ways with this. Number one, before you became depressed, if there's a clear before and after, or who you could have been if circumstances had been changed and you had been able to be a happy person. So I think it's important to sort of look back at the positives too. We're really always so focused on the negatives, but again, we're a big person, and depression is a part of that, but it's not all of that, even though it feels like it so often. So it's important to look back too and see, where's the good in me at that time? And to find it and to identify it and to connect with it. Because there are often, when we decide to make a change, it's very easy to say, I just want to change everything about who I am, and I'm going to leave the rest in the past. But there are really great things about us, even when we're depressed. I mean, when we're depressed, we're sensitive, we notice things. We are very tapped into our internal lives. So while we can take those to an extreme in ways that are not healthy, the basis of each of those things is very healthy and very meaningful. It's great to be very sensitive in ways that allow you to experience the world more deeply than somebody who's not. So I think it's also important when we're deciding to make a change to look back and say, okay, there are things I want to let go of and leave in the past, and there are things I want to bring forward with me into the present. Because we don't need to throw out all of who we are when we're making a change. We can pick and choose. And so I think it's in the picking and choosing, again, that we also start to reclaim our power. So the first part is to look back, to grieve, to honor, and respect, and choose what you want to bring forward. So does that make sense so far?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very much so. And I think a lot of people may not understand that the grieving process is a huge part of it. But again, that's where, maybe working with a coach or working with a therapist can help that process. But, a lot of the reason I think these emotions get stuck is because we block maybe wanting to feel them, and then it just kind of builds up until we just feel like, oh, these emotions are stuck, so this may be the way we are supposed to be because of this event has happened.
That's true. In Eastern medicine, any pain is caused by a blockage of energy. And so in Eastern medicine, any pain that you have in the body, they will start working on, okay, we have to open that passageway so that we unblock it, so there's no stasis. And that's the whole idea of acupuncture even. And I love that idea for who we are emotionally and even spiritually. Where are you blocked? Because it's in the block that your pain originates. And if you can unblock that, untangle the knots that are in there and open up that passageway so that things can flow, so that there is a flow of energy, then it makes their whole process, it defines your whole process basically. And then it makes the whole process so much easier so that by the end, you have a full flow in who you are rather than bits and pieces all working at odds with each other.
Yeah.
So to speak to what you were saying, I totally agree. And I think that then once we do the work on the past and reach that place of saying, okay, I've got it. I've grieved, I've honored, I've chosen what I want to bring forward. Then you step into the present, and this is never a comfortable place because we're usually so miserable in the present, but you step in there and say, okay, who am I, in this moment? So if you start by saying, who did I used to be, or who could I have been? And then move into the present, well, who am I now? And really get clear on who it is, because you're not just someone who's depressed. There's so much more to who you are. Again, we are a whole entity, each one of us, and depression is just a part of it. It would, be comparable to saying that all of New York City is not just the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building is a part of New York City. So it's stepping into that space of, this is the present moment. Who am I now? Yes, the Empire State Building is a part of me in this moment. Who else am I? What else is going on in here? And sometimes that's a really hard question to answer because it's like we have blinders on and all we can see is the depression. But if I had asked myself that question and been honest about it, because I was very unwilling to see anything outside of my depression, even though my mom would constantly try to make this point to me, which is, look at all the other things that you're doing. They also define who you are. But if we're willing to be open to saying, okay, what else defines who I am? During my years of that Black depression, I was I was an MFA student. Then I became a published poet. I was a playwright. I was a professor at a university in New York City. So I was other things. I didn't accept them as part of what defined me because the pain was so much greater than all of those things put together. But if we can take a step outside of ourselves and look at ourselves the way other people do, we start to widen the perspective of our lens. And the more we can see, the more we can heal. Because when you see more, there are more opportunities, more moments that you see options for change. And so you become more creative and more flexible. And the more creativity and flexibility we develop in ourselves, the more healthy we are. I mean, that's basics of biology. The more your body is in homeostasis, the more healthy you are. Same thing goes for your mind. So in the present moment, it's standing in that space and saying, who am I now? And bring it on. Really define it. Depression, a given. What else is there? So that you start to really see what else is going on outside for you, whether that's in a personal way, a social way, a professional way, or in a universal way, so that you start getting some greater perspective on yourself. And then in that moment, looking at both sides, what do you really hate about who you have become? Who are you now? And what are the things that you can appreciate about who you are now? Because maybe finding things that you love is too challenging in that moment. But it's possible to say, okay, well, I really hate X, Y, and Z about me, but okay, I can sort of appreciate A and B. And in that way, starting to create a more balanced perspective of yourself. which isn't easy, is it, Craig? but it helps you start to reclaim a sense of perspective.
Yeah. Well, I found it interesting that even though you were all these other things while you were still dealing with your traumatic episode, you blocked that portion of yourself out so you could concentrate on being in the traumatic feelings and the traumatic emotions. And even though you had all these other aspects of yourself and successes, those somehow did not become your identity.
And that's so, isn't that the saddest thing?
Yeah.
I mean, to be a poet and be published is a great accomplishment. To be a playwright and get produced, great accomplishment. To be invited to become a professor at a university, great accomplishment. And yet none of them mattered. It was like, that's just the stuff I do while I'm busy being depressed. And so it is really sad. And when I look back, I remember those moments of accomplishment, feeling like, oh, I have to go to, they were hard moments for me because I didn't want to have to be in them. Everybody else would celebrate. For example, I'm thinking of my MFA graduation, and my parents were just so proud. And I was just like, oh, could we just go home now? Because it's exhausting to be depressed, and it's hard to fake being happy and excited about stuff when your depression is just sitting on you like the greatest weight in the world. And that's why I think it's so important for us to notice what else is going on and be forced to sit in that space because we choose to. A lot of change and a lot of reclaiming our identity and everything really that we're talking about, Craig, has to come from inside. So it has to be at a time when you feel ready to do this stuff. And I was flat out not ready for a really long time. The challenge for me was I really felt like if I went into the whole process of overcoming the depression, I didn't think I was mentally strong enough to do it. I mean, forget about the accomplishments, quote unquote, that I had professionally. Emotionally, intellectually, mentally, I felt so fragile that I was literally afraid if I tried to work in the ways that were necessary to heal, I felt that I would end up in a psychiatric ward in a straitjacket. So I spent a lot of time running around, quote unquote, achieving in the outside world because that was how I managed trying to run away from the fear that I had that my mind was going to overcome me. Yeah. And so it wasn't until I realized that was not the truth that I actually started doing something. But for a long time, I think it's really easy to be afraid of what it means to start trying to make change and what it means to going through depression is, it's scary. And so I always thought if I'm going to overcome it, I'm going to have to go through it. And I'm having enough trouble where I am in it. I don't want to go deeper into it. And then what will happen to me? So it was really hard for me to get to a place where I could say, okay, I'm going to do this now. And I only got there, frankly, because the thought of not doing it had become more terrifying than actually doing the work.
Right. But, for somebody who's maybe still in the phase that they're identifying with their depression and identifying their trauma, what can they do? What is the one thing they can do right now to maybe move towards starting the process of letting it go?
I would say, and this is going to be not what anyone else would say, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I don't think that there's really a big action that we can take if we're in that space. I'm thinking back to myself, Craig, like there was absolutely nothing that you could have said to me that would make me get going. So I don't want to offer something like that, which I'm not saying is what you were asking for, but it's why I'm sort of going to go off the beaten path. I think the most important thing is to hope that we can feel differently. And so I would say the first thing to do to get into a mode of making change is to just simply start hoping. just really focus on developing that hope. Healing is really all about reaffirming life. To me, that's what it is. Because when we're depressed, we're very disconnected from life. And healing is all about reconnecting to living and feeling good about it. So I would say that the first thing you can do, and it's a gentle thing, is just to start developing hope. What does it mean to hope? Hoping means developing the belief that, and the optimistic belief, I should say, developing the optimistic belief that things could be different. So I would say just move through the day looking for little clues, little ideas about what it would be like for things to be different. And if life could be different, maybe it's just, well, I could go out of my house. Well, okay, hold on to that idea. Because what would it be like if you could go out of your house? And the more you start connecting to the hope for what the change can bring, the more you start actually training your brain to be looking for ways to do that. So there's a scientific benefit to it. But also, the more you sort of gently segue yourself into a place where you become more comfortable with the idea of the work that needs to be done. And I think that's a more gentle way to enter the process.
Yeah. Well, I want to let everybody know where they can find out more about you and the work you're doing. The website is healmyptsd.com, and it's PTSD for post-traumatic stress disorder, healmyptsd.com. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you're working on right now, Michele, and the ways people may be able to get in touch with you and maybe even work with you, with workshops or maybe coaching and things like that.
Absolutely. And actually, Craig, I'm also going to let everyone know that the website that will have actually all the information about what we've been talking about today, healmyptsd.com, is a fantastic site if you have post-traumatic stress disorder and are interested in symptoms and treatment management. But my other site is Change You Choose. And that site is really devoted to what we've been talking about today. How do you make change? How do we get that done? What does that look like? So changeyouchoose.com has my books on it. So that includes Before the World Intruded and also my forthcoming book, Your Life After Trauma, Powerful Practices to Reclaim Your Identity. And then we also have my radio show, which is called Changing Direction. So it's all about how do we accomplish the changes that we want to make in our lives. And finally, we have this I'm having so much fun with this. We launched a free webinar series called How Trauma Affects Your Brain. And it's really about so many different facets of that. So the first installment was about the science behind symptoms, including depression. And next month, we're doing reversing how trauma affects your brain. And so each month, we're doing something differently. And anyone who wants to join us can sign up right on changeyouchoose.com, the website, which is also where you can reach me. My contact page is right there. You can shoot me a note anytime.
Well, thank you so much, Michele. It's always a great pleasure talking with you. You have such amazing information, and I just so appreciate all the work you're doing.
Thank you, Craig. And I know we're out of time, and I just want to wrap up by saying that in the process that we were talking about reclaiming your identity, I said in the beginning there are 3 phases. So we went over the past and the present, and the last one is the future, getting really clear on who it is you want to be, because we know that we only actually achieve the things we are really clear about what we want to create. So the more clear you become on what kind of person do you want to be, what kind of traits, qualities, characteristics do you want to exhibit, what kind of values do you want to define you, pulling together a really clear vision of who this future self is, and then reverse engineering it, which is, the whole process that's in the book, Your Life After Trauma. How do you reverse engineer reclaiming that whole identity or constructing it for the first time and moving in to embody it? So leaving everyone with the idea that you can absolutely look at your past, acknowledge your present, and then create your future in a way that makes you feel really good about who you are, regardless of what you've struggled through, and that healing is always possible. We each have potential for that. So the goal is just learning how to access it.
Well, what you have to offer is so brilliant, and it's helping so many people. And I so thank you again for taking your time this morning and talking to me and doing this interview. And if anybody has any sort of want or need or desire to just feel better and start the process of healing their traumatic episodes that may have happened in their life or dealing with their depression, certainly seek Michele out and find her website and read her books and find out what there is to do to heal. Because Michele, you've been doing this for a while, helping people with through their journeys, and it's an amazing thing that you're doing. I so appreciate
Thank you, Craig.
Talking with us.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's always such a pleasure to chat with you.
Michele is an amazing person and a wonderful teacher and coach. I originally interviewed her for the End Depression Now telesummit a few years ago, and I'm so glad we were able to talk again. If you'd like to hear more from Michele and would like to listen to that original interview, please click the link below if you're on her Tipping Point radio page, or just go to depression180.com/Michele. Michele. depression180.com/Michele.